I would like to wish a very good morning to our honorable guests, Professor Trudie Roberts, Professor of Medical Education, Leeds Institute of Medical Education, Professor John Orsini, President Emeritus FAMA, our dearest participants, dearest lecturers, staff, students, and everyone present today again. So without further ado, we shall begin our event of the day with the first keynote talk. I'd like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Trudie Roberts. Professor Roberts graduated in medicine from Manchester. In 2000, she was appointed Professor of Medical Education at the University of Leeds and was awarded a National Teaching Fellowship in 2006. Professor Roberts has served as a council member of the GMC and RCP London and chair of the Association for the Study of Medical Education and also previously a censor for the RCP London. She was president of the Association for Medical Education in Europe until August 2019 and is an education board member for the RCPS Glasgow. She is married to a surgeon, has 2 children, and still dreams of owning a Subaru WRX, but recognizes she may have to settle for a mobility scooter. Now, I would like to welcome Professor Roberts to the floor.
Thank you. Everyone is different. You are a group of unique individuals, and we're distinctly different, and we have different abilities, and we have different needs. But however, there are lots of times when we're treated the same, and sometimes that's a good thing, of course. If we were up before the law, we would want to be treated the same. We would want to be treated equally, and we would want to be treated fairly. So, as I say, you can see we're all different, okay, like little Lego people. And as I say, there's times when it's good to be treated the same. It's good when we're treated the same sometimes, but a lot of times we actually want to be treated differently, in actual fact. And it would be a good thing. And for some of you, I just want to remind you what watching TV was like before the internet. So there are some people, and I think probably John and I would remember this. But this was what the TV was like in the early 1950s, okay? One channel, one set of programs, and usually the man of the house had control over what you saw, and everybody watched together and watched the same thing. And if you went out, you missed it, and you never saw it again, okay? Now, of course, with things you can download, with Netflix, with box sets and so forth, you can see it at your leisure. I notice that the man still has the controls, though, here on this one. So I still find that quite irritating. But in actual fact, now when you look at people are watching things differently. So people have different needs, they have different wants, and they want to watch things at different paces. So Vishnu likes box sets, John likes to keep waiting for the next installment. Things are very different, and so there's a lot of personalization. This is the era of personalization. And actually, of course, within medicine, this is the era of personalization. So 2 people may have diabetes, but in fact the treatment could be quite different depending on their genome, the way they react to drugs, and so forth. So in lots of areas, it's different. But actually, why isn't it different in education? If we were 2 people who were medical students on the same course, we would have different abilities. My colleague here may be very good at cardiology. I may be awful at cardiology, but very good at neurology, and vice versa. And yet, our weekly timetable would be exactly the same. So isn't it about time we started to respond to people's personal needs and wants? And myPAL at Leeds stands for My Personal Adaptive Learning at Leeds, and that's obviously where I work. Of course, a PAL is also someone like this. This is a PAL, someone who helps you and supports you, maybe even a mentor. So students have lots of individual weaknesses and strengths. And actually, there are different paths to success. We might all want students to achieve a certain standard at the end, but the way they get there may be very different. And that's no problem. That's very good in actual fact. But how do we support that? Well, technology, I'm going to show you how I think technology can support individualization in education and supporting students get to that goal by their own route. So what we want to do, of course, is to support students to become self-regulated learners. So what my colleague was just talking about was actually going onto a site, doing a self-evaluation, and then looking at what my strengths and what my areas for development are, and then actually looking for resources to help me get there. But we know that actually, in self-evaluation, we're usually quite poor. I don't want to say I'm bad at anything, so therefore it's difficult for me to admit that there are areas of weakness. So how do we help students identify their areas of weakness and strength, set their own personal learning goals, and develop ways to achieve these goals? We can't abandon them. And we also, of course, are setting them to be lifelong learners, how to set the pace for themselves after they leave university and education, and constantly seek ways to improve their practice in their postgraduate training. This is probably one of the greatest mentors, Yoda, to have someone sat on your shoulder advising you what to do all the time. But in Leeds, we don't have 300 Yodas, actually. So we have 300 students in a cohort in a year, and I know that you have an awful lot, and probably more than that. And students need to be trained to accept feedback and to use it in a purposeful and positive way. And mentors need to be trained to give feedback. Too many times I see, Mr. Norsini, that was okay. What does that mean? You know, how good was it? Was it really okay, or was it just okay, or is it pretty poorly okay? So how do we help and train people? And it's a huge amount of work in actual fact. So the question that we asked ourselves was, could technology help solve this problem for us? And I'm going to show you here the type of technology that we're using. Let me say at the outset, it's not perfect. This is a program in evolution and something that we're working on. So we were looking for a solution, and what we hit upon was something called the quantified self. And this is where you take all the data about you and start to actually interrogate it and understand what that means about your abilities and areas for development. So we have, like all medical schools, huge amounts of data on students' performance. We have it on end-of-year exams, we have it on in-course assessments, we have it on tutorial work, and it's all over the place. Sometimes it's on the university's website, the secure website. Sometimes it's in people's drawers, sometimes it's students have it. It's everywhere. And we wanted to see whether we could utilize all this data by bringing it together to give each student a comprehensive learner profile of their own. So we're looking at the numbers first of all, and numbers can give you a certain understanding of individual. They can paint a picture, if you like, and you can see a picture here which is made of numbers and grades, and you can see what it is, but it's not very detailed. You can't see the detail. So actually, we wanted to look at all the student data, not just the end of term grades or the numbers, the percentages that people had to pass an exam. So we had the assessment grades and scores, as I've said, but we actually wanted to look at the narrative feedback. What was the feedback that tutors were giving in a narrative way? And how could we use that? So we looked at text analytics. Could we get programs to analyze that text to bring out positive things? Because otherwise, that meant some of us reading 300 students' narrative feedback, and if they get 4 pieces of feedback in a week, we would do nothing else, and it would be highly, highly inefficient. And if we do that, then I would say to you, we can get something that gives you a much better image of that individual. So it's using text as well as scores and grades. Now, I said that very quickly, and it's easy to say quickly, but it's not easy to do. So we wanted myPAL to be part of this solution. So we wanted to take all the assessment and feedback a student had, give it to that student, get them then to be trained to use that, which will help their study in practice. So they would use all that information to say, I'm really good at neurology, so I'm not going to go to the neurology lecture because I'm pretty poor at cardiology. And at the same time there's a neurology lecture, there's a cardiology clinic I could go to. So within a week, it might be that my program of study might look quite different to yours depending upon our strengths and areas for development. And what would have helped us to identify those would have been all this data. So it wasn't just me thinking, I pretty like cardiology, I'll pop along to the clinic. This was actually founded in actual data. So the vision was to create a digital companion, something that you would have at your fingertips the whole time. As you know, and I'm sure it's true, that all our young people, in fact all of you, you're more or less grafted to your phones. If people lose a phone, they start to have a panic attack, I've noticed. Oh, where's my phone? Oh my God, my whole life's finished, I can't do anything. So this would support you becoming a self-regulated learner, and we wanted to co-design this with tutors and with students, because I have spent my life building things, writing study manuals that nobody has read, I have to tell you. And nobody has read them because they weren't of use, and they didn't actually address a need that a tutor or a student had. So this was all the type of data that we had. And it's data that you will recognize. You'll have collected on all your students as well. And it was putting it together into what I term a data warehouse, which only Kang will understand, and a few more of you techie people, because I don't. I use that term just loosely. But with students, if we start to analyze every bit of what they're doing, they start to get very anxious. They are following me. They're checking up on me. Because, of course, we could actually look at how many times they go to the library. Because when they go to the library, they have to scan in and scan out with their library card. We could check up how many books they take out. But what would it tell us, and how useful would it be? You could take all the books out you like, as I did when I was a student, but if you leave them at the side of your bed and never read them, it doesn't really help. I think I thought that they might osmose into me, but it never happened. I even tried putting them under my pillow. It still didn't happen, I can tell you. So we wanted students to be a true partner in this program to help us develop it. So we then asked who else besides students or within students who would use this program. And of the students, there were these three types of students that we identified. High flyers who may have had one poor result, and then that sends them into a tailspin of, oh my God, I'm a failure, because they're very highly competitive and slightly neurotic. And I have to say, I wouldn't like to say this, I'm sure you'll keep it a secret, the girls are much worse than the boys, I have to say. Then there are those borderline students who are passing, but they're only just passing, and we need those people to know and understand, actually, you need to up your game here to be safe. And then, of course, those who are at risk, who we want to identify so we can put in things to help them, and we don't want to wait till they crash and burn completely. But in addition to that, we also had staff who would want to use myPAL, which would be course administrators, to look at how placements were doing. If all the students were not so good at examining the abdomen, for example, where were they being taught this? What could we do to actually support the teachers there? And then, tutors, so that they could actually, if you have your personal tutor, if you allowed them to see your profile, they could see what were your areas for development and help you develop a learning plan. Because we've all got good intentions. I've got good intentions for when I go home to put myself on a diet, having been here 8 days and eaten non-stop. But will I do that? I can say, you know, I would do it, but somebody's got to check up, are you doing it, Professor Roberts? So we had this data warehouse set up. We imported all the data that we had, and we released the first version, because we had to give students something to look at, in 2016. And then more recently, what we've done is to actually look with students at this and how well they were using it, how we could make it better for them. So this is where co-design came. We didn't do it right from the very beginning because we wanted to give students something to look at. And we looked at using workplace-based assessments, and John's going to talk about those in more detail later. But all to say is that these are specialist placements, assessments which are done in placement and are very common now in medical and other healthcare training. So we tried co-design, and we also had learning analytics. And I'm just going to take you through these two areas quickly. So we'll start off by looking at co-design. And when you do co-design, you really do have to do working with students. So we ran workshops with students and with tutors as well. And we started off by looking at current practice, and it was an iterative process. So we made changes, and then we showed it back to the people, both the tutors and the students, and then we made more changes again. We didn't just assume it was a one-off process. And we prototyped them. And the most important thing I think that we did was we did it in paper. Okay, we didn't do it, we used paper prototypes because you could change those around. We didn't try to do that in a highly tech environment. And so the first phase of the co-design was to look at how they currently use the myPAL product. What did you use? How did you use it? Did you open it every day? Did it help you? And then how do you approach your work-based assessments? We know that in general, there are two types of approaches. If, say, in a 4-week placement, students have to do 6 workplace assessments, there were some students who, at the end of the first week, did 1, and then they did 2 the second week, and were really on top of it. And then we know there was a second kind of student that waited till week 4, and then were like, oh my God, I've got 6 to do, and they run around trying to get them done. And in fact, of course, as these things are meant to be developmental, that is, you look at how you did last time to influence what your learning should be for the next time, that was of no use to us. And also, in work done by my colleague Richard Fuller, we know that those students who didn't properly time manage it did worse in the other exams, like the knowledge exam and the OSCE. So if we could identify those students, we could perhaps nudge them into doing something a little bit more sensible. And I'll talk about nudges towards the end, just briefly. And then we asked, what do you want to find out from myPAL? What would it really help you finding out? And how could we show you that in a way which was useful? Initially, colleagues made box and whisker plots, and they are deeply unexciting, I have to say. And I'm not certain how much they tell you. What you need to be able to know straight away when you look at it, how am I doing? How am I doing? How's my trajectory? Am I doing okay? Am I going to pass? Because whatever students ask you, however they dress it up, that's what they want to know. So we had 5 student workshops, 4 tutor workshops, and these were the numbers here, and 10 hours of audio data that we transcribed, and all these visualizations which were created in paper. And when you actually look at the visualizations, you need a lot of 3-colored pens, you need a lot of paper, you need a lot of almost like Play-Doh, it becomes like Play School, and it's actually quite fun. But the types of things that students were wanting were things like, how does this attempt at doing, say, taking blood compare with my previous one? How am I doing? Am I getting better each time? So that was the attempt comparison within their own abilities. And the other thing they wanted to know, how am I doing against expectations? So what would you expect for me to be able to do at this stage in my training? And then surprisingly to us, they wanted comparison against their colleagues. And we were slightly surprised at that. And we're actually not keen on this particularly, but in the UK, where you are in comparison to your colleagues does contribute to the job you get after you graduate. So this may well work to that. I think it probably does. Whether this is useful, I'm not certain itself. If you're doing okay, does it matter if you're in the top or bottom quartile, as long as you're doing okay and your trajectory is all right? I think that's something for you to discuss. So then we looked at all the different types of visualizations and grouped them together. And we chose 3, because you can't do everything. We chose 3 to take into the second phase. And the 3 you can see there are, how am I doing, how am I progressing, and what do I need to do? So we took those 3, because they were the most frequently asked, and we wanted to actually then look at how we might present those in terms of visualizations. And these were the types of things that we started to work with students, again, in paper prototypes, which we will, and we have, converted to actually electronic versions. So let's look at the learning analytics. And this, for me, was a completely new arena. And I have to say, I found it fascinating and quite challenging. So what we need from learning analytics, or what we needed, were these things. We wanted to get providers for multiple sources of data, both quantitative and qualitative, as I've said. And we wanted to be able to develop reliable proxies for learner characteristics. So looking at short feedback, what did the words in there tell us about the student? And of course, as our clinicians and our teachers are different in individuals, the way they give feedback, the words they use are very different. And we didn't want to actually say to them, only use these words. We felt, A, they wouldn't do it, and B, it was very restrictive. So those were the text analytics. And then we wanted to look at temporal patterns of analytics. When did people start to get feedback? When did they start to look at it? Did they look at it in a longitudinal way, or did they just look at it just before exams? How did they use that? And what granularity would they want to actually be able to see? And then we wanted to provide a combination of these two types of analytics to actually then nudge students into the behavior we thought would be most profitable for them. So the text analytics with this sort of thing, we looked at the feedback length of something for a student. And actually what we found was that the longer the feedback from the tutor was, the longer the response was from the student in general. So if you wrote me a nice long piece of feedback, which was very detailed, my response to it was equally long and detailed, and particularly often led to a plan, a learning plan. Whereas if John just wrote, she's okay, then I would write, fine, and that would be it. And we actually went along one stage of doing, instead of like Twitter where you have a maximum number of characters, we had a minimum number of characters for some people, be able to do that. And we wanted to actually look at word sequences doing very well. So an active thing, and it's a grade as well. And of course, I'm not doing this. Very clever people, computer people are doing this. So, and then we wanted to, as I say, look at the commonality similarity between the feedback and the comment from the student and their plan to what they were going to do about that. And then we looked at the vocabulary. So things like technical words that we use in the feedback, verbs that we use, doing things, we would suggest you did things. And again, same from the students, I will do. These are the sorts of things we're looking at. And the sentiments, whether it's a neutral thing or whether it's a positive or a negative thing, to help us build this picture of the student. If we look at temporal analytics too, we can see differences for the whole cohort here. You can see that just before exams here in the top corner there, you can see. No. You can see that there's bursts of people looking at their feedback just before exams and so forth to look at what they have to do. And then we looked at clustering of when they were getting the feedback as well, and then process mining, how this was going on for the whole group, for the whole cohort of students. What was happening? Was it happening at different times for different parts of the cohort? And then the types of things, you can't see it on here, but I'll leave the slides and you can look at it. The types of activity that students were doing and getting the most feedback on. So we then took this back to the tutors and the students and said, what would be most useful for you at this time? We can't do everything. And so we then came up with this, if you like, prioritization table, which showed us the things that we wanted to move on with now and the things that would actually be okay and we could collect, but we couldn't use them now, but would use them in the future. And again, to share that with tutors and with students. If you're collecting lots of data, people expect you to use it and they want the answers back now. If you say, we're collecting all this data, this we can use now because you said it's most important and we'll feed it back to you. This we're going to collect, but we won't be feeding it back to you until the next year. At least you're actually managing their expectations. So this is the future work for us, process mining, to look at exploring patterns of behavior for the whole cohort. We're looking at clinical skills vocabulary particularly because that's a relatively straightforward skill set for us. And then we want to look at is detecting action plans for students. And do students who write better action plans, do they do better in their exams? Are they more successful? To see if we can then nudge those students who are not writing good action plans to do that and why to do it. Because again, writing an action plan is fine, but it's enacting that action plan that's really the crucial thing, isn't it? So I just wanted to spend the last last slide just talking about recommending and nudging. Now, if you are, as you will be, someone who buys things from Amazon like I do, you know every time you put Amazon on, it says, people like you, because they've tracked you, also like this sort of thing. So it's all very well as building myPAL, which tells you how well you're doing or not doing, and areas that you should develop. But we've got to actually point people to resources. So it might be people who've made an action plan like yours found these resources very useful. So if we can actually make recommendations, and not only faculty make recommendations, but other students as well. So if students have found a website which is very good to learn about ECG interpretation, I probably don't know that, but they'll know that. They could recommend it, a bit like TripAdvisor or a bit like a recommendation on Amazon, and give it a certain number of points. And therefore, we would actually be pointing students to resources, and they would be helping us point other students to resources that they'd found useful. And then finally, nudges. I don't know how many of you have something like this in some form or other, a Fitbit. It's usually the worried well, it's the neurotic middle classes. But in an hour's time, it will say to me, breathe. And that's such an irritating thing, isn't it? What do you think I've been doing for the last, 60-odd years? But it will say, stand up or do this. I actually personally, I find those nudges extraordinarily irritating. But however, later on at night, it says, in a 15-minute walk, you could close all the rings. I'm like, oh, well, maybe I'll do that. So sometimes nudges are quite good. And we can give nudges to students. So it's the first week of your placement. You've got 6 workplace-based assessments to do. Why not talk to the practice nurse about learning to do a blood pressure? And you then just nudging them to do one thing in the first week. And it's little bite-sized bits of learning. So they don't arrive at week 4 with all 6 of these to do. And you know yourself, I'm an inveterate list writer. And if I can tick a few things off, it makes me feel so much better about myself. Of course, I do get to the end of some days when I'm having to write things on the list that I've done already and tick them off, because otherwise it's deeply depressing. So we're looking into things like recommending and nudging. And I think that we'll end up by allowing students to turn those things on or off. Because if it irritates you more than anything else, then it's actually a negative sort of thing, isn't it? I'd just like to thank the core team here, because it's not me, it's them. They're the clever ones. And to come back to what I was saying before, this time it's personal. And I'll give some sweets to anybody who can tell me where that comes from and who said it. This time it's personal. And we're hoping that myPAL at Leeds will be able to help our students to get that personalisation. And I'm happy to take questions, or although I know we may be short of time, I stand between you and the break. So I'm happy to hang around at the break and answer questions then as well. So thank you very much.
Yeah, sure. Is there any questions from the floor, from the audience?
2016, right? So how's the progress so far with the uptake and
uptake is improving. You've got to keep renewing it. You've got to keep asking students, because otherwise they'll say, I didn't know it was there. Yes, and the difficulty that we have is that within that group of people I showed you, we've got people who've now left to enhance their careers. So how do we keep it going? And it's not easy, and the computation behind it is quite considerable. So we're actually starting to look now at whether we should look for commercial partners to be able to do this, because it's a big undertaking. The university have been looking at their own similar sort of thing, but their own one is a top-down thing. Have you paid your fees? Have you attended these sort of things? Whereas actually we wanted a bottom-up one for students, so they are somewhat different. And the university have started to look for an off-the-shelf model, which we would not have. So it's a big undertaking. We've gone on to version 2 and 3, but of course every time the platform is updated and software is updated, we have to update the whole thing. So it's a big undertaking, and you're right to bring that out.
Is there any role for this? Do you consider self-assessment by the students in analytic learning?
Yeah, I think what we wanted to do. Have you seen these spider diagrams?
yes,
Like a cobweb spider diagram. I quite like those myself, because I like things that instantly tell me how I'm doing. And so when our students are meant to go to a workplace placement, they're meant to say to the placement lead, my name's Trudie Roberts, and I'm really glad to be here on your placement here, Dr. Norsini. I've got my learning needs, and we could perhaps discuss them. Whereupon Dr. Norsini just walks off to see a patient because they're busy, and so that never happens. We've asked tutors to do that. So as a tutor, I'm meant to say, welcome, Vishnu, to our unit. Tell me about your learning outcomes, and that never happens either. But so what we wanted to do was to develop a little spider's web with the main outcomes, and that the student would plot their self-assessment on, and they could show that to the tutor, because within 2 seconds you can actually see how somebody is doing. And then at the end of that placement, the tutor would then put their own assessment on that. And of course, if you're very good at self-assessment, they should completely overlap. I would have thought that's quite rare myself. But so that's a type of visualization that we were starting to look at, something that could be done very quickly. Because what the tutor said, haven't got time for all this chitty-chatting. We need to see something straight away.
Okay. So, Prof, from this, do you feel that the time has come that these systems are more powerful in teaching or even for students as learning rather than humans teaching?
No, not at all. I mean, this will never take, this is, if you like, is an electronic mentor system, if you like. And this is to address those extra needs of students. Because I have another slide which I didn't put in that showed students just like little chicks, more and more feedback. You give me more feedback. And then I've got another slide which shows, the faculty overwhelmed by paperwork thinking, I can't do this. So this is an adjunct for that. But the best feedback will be face-to-face and somebody getting you to make a plan and actually then checking up on you to see whether you've actually done that. So this is to supplement that, but it will never, ever take over from it.
Thank you so much, Professor Trudie Roberts. So now I would like to invite Professor Vishna to present a token of appreciation.
It's not fair. I don't get chocolates.
Remember, I promised my chocolates to whoever gets this.
Anyone knows that? Where that? This time it's personal. Okay, Anu.
Yeah, which version? Yeah, you see. I think she's just looked up on her phone. But
That's the thing. You can just put the statement.
yeah, I shall give my
Okay,
things
so I'll
to
give it to
later.
you first for accountability.